So, Brian, let's just talk turkey here, mister. It is the night before the election. As I wrote in our newsletter today, the most consequential election, I think, of my lifetime. What are we seeing in the polls right now? And I guess, what are we seeing in terms of trends? Because I know you think polls are pretty reliable, but who knows, right?
Well, they're reliable, but there's a limit to what they can accomplish. And Katie, thanks, first of all, for having me. It's such a pleasure always talking to you. There's a McSweeney's headline that I thought was hilarious today that said there's a 100% chance that anything can fucking happen. And
You
and there
can say
was,
that on
I
Instagram
know,
Live,
I
Brian.
figured I could say it. I
Yeah.
figured I could say it. Another friend of mine who's Jewish tweeted that tonight is Pol Nidre, which I thought was also funny the night before. I mean, the serious answer to your question is I'd rather be Harris than Trump, but not by much. This has been an extraordinarily close race, and I think we should sort of step back and put it into a little bit of context. You know, this was a really tightly competitive, hotly contested race for the year that it was effectively a race between Trump and Biden, a rematch, the race that sort of nobody wanted. Then there was that disastrous debate. Biden fell substantially behind in the polls to the point where it looked like Trump was headed for an electoral vote landslide. Um, Harris replaced him. And from that moment, kind of through her convention, through the 10 days after her convention, kind of the, post uh, convention period, she
Right.
clawed her way back to even, and maybe a little bit ahead. I think her momentum was effectively stopped by the Trump paid media, starting about a week or two after the debate. I should have mentioned, by the way, that the Harris debate performance was very effective too. Clearly played a big role in helping her get to even.
I thought
Um,
the
and
DNC was really well done as well. I think the positive
very well
message seemed
done.
to resonate. I thought her speech was really good. I think, she was being introduced to many Americans for the first time, and many still had yet to get to know her, but I thought it went off pretty seamlessly.
Well, and you think of poor Stephanie Cutter like getting the memo less than 3 weeks before the convention that she was going to have to tear up what she had been planning for, a year at that point and start from scratch on a Harris convention. But anyway, getting back to the race as it stands now, I think Trump's paid media and maybe some more balanced Republicans would say, more hostile Democrats would say, coverage in the earned media kind of slowed her momentum, stopped her forward movement. Um, and I think it was about tied through most of October. And then I think what happened is the Madison Square Garden event reinforced a lot of worries and doubts that swing voters have about Trump. I mean, bear in mind, uh, even 2 weeks ago, 3 to 5% of this electorate was not totally locked down in one camp or the other.
Right.
Those are the swing voters. You have another camp that's trying to decide whether to vote or not. But I think Harris has clearly won more of the undecideds than Trump
Mhm.
has. The Harris campaign says that they're winning undecideds by about 10 points more than Trump is.
Also called
And
late break, also called late breaking or late, right? But, there's another term for the undecided who really decide at the very last minute,
right,
right? And
exactly.
and she's doing much better with the people who are deciding late in the game. And but how big a percentage of the electorate are those undecided voters at this point? I guess any little bit helps, but
Well,
it's
the
a
night
pretty small
before,
percentage.
it's really tiny. I mean, a couple weeks ago, it was 3 or 4%. And so if you're winning that 3 or 4% by a 10-point margin, I mean, look, you're talking about way less than 1%. You're into the world of basis points, but it is that close of an election in the 7 battlegrounds. Now, it's important to note we have 7 battlegrounds, about half in the Sun Belt, half in the industrial Midwest, the Rust Belt. All but one of them were carried by Joe Biden. The only battleground that Trump won 4 years ago was North Carolina. It is interesting, and I'll let you resume asking questions after I finish this thought, that one of the great tells of campaigns is not what the campaigns say, but what they actually do. Where do they put their candidate? Where are they spending their money? And of the 6 days before the election tomorrow, Trump has been in North Carolina for 4 out of 6 of those days. Not necessarily all of the days, but at least in part, Trump has been in North Carolina, a state that he won 4 years ago that he should have in the bag at this point. So that reveals, I think, a real concern on their part
But you think
about that state.
so you think North Carolina is up for grabs, even though Trump is ahead in the polls, as you mentioned, the governor with this sort of sleazy, the gubernatorial candidate with this sleazy, like weird porn habit and talking about, I don't know,
Talking about
Hitler.
being a black Nazi.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's yeah.
and I don't even want to get into it though. He's dead in the water, so to speak,
He's
right?
dead in
He
the
is
water. I
not,
mean, it's kind of a reflection, by the way, of Trump's Teflon. Like Trump still has like 100 times more baggage than Mark Robinson, the Republican gubernatorial candidate you're referring to. I mean, Mark Robinson does not have 2 dozen women who have publicly come out and accused him of harassment or assault. I mean, the list for Trump is so huge and so long, you can't begin to wrap your mind around it. But Robinson is dead in the water. He's double digits behind, and Trump is tied. North Carolina is tied. Georgia is tied. Just to kind of go through the states
yeah.
quickly, Michigan, I would say Harris has a slight edge. Wisconsin is the other state where she has a slight edge. Pennsylvania is incredibly competitive. Arizona, I would say Harris is probably a little behind, and Nevada is just dead even. Just total. I was in Nevada yesterday. It is all the pros there will tell you dead even.
Wow. Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks because I know people are like, we love Brian, but can you tell us what is the latest? So, but
I'm doing my best here.
no, enough of the context. They're saying like, okay, so I saw a national poll by PBS and NPR saying Harris was ahead by 4 points nationally. Obviously, the popular vote is one thing, the electoral college is another thing. But how do the national polls look right now?
She looks around 3 or 4 points ahead in the national vote. But, you know, that's kind of less significant this time than it
Right.
was last time because the coalitions are changing. You know, Trump is overperforming, at least we think he is, with working class voters, not just white working class voters, but Latino working class voters and maybe even some black men. Now, what that could mean for him is actually gaining votes in a kind of inefficient way. Trump could be winning a lot more, you know, Cubans and Nicaraguans in Florida, Dominicans, I was going to say Puerto Ricans in New York, but maybe not so much after Madison Square Garden. Maybe he's going to do a little bit better in the Central Valley and in Orange County in California. But none of those states matter
Right.
to getting to 270. And so I'm not sure that Trump's gains are really efficient gains for him in terms of the states he needs. Because you have this sort of odd thing where um, white voters are significantly more Democratic in the upper Midwest than they are in the Sun Belt. Latinos in Arizona and Nevada are significantly more Democratic than they are in Florida. So he may not be kind of squeezing all the juice out of those gains, so to speak, just because of a bunch of, you know, quirks among different
Well, I
constituency
was
groups.
going to say it depends on the state, right? Let's talk about Pennsylvania for a second. Obviously, it is neck and neck. Joe Biden is from Scranton. Um, is there any affection left for Joe Biden in his home
I'm
state?
sure there is, but I'm sure those votes are already in the bag for Harris. That affection, I don't think, is going to produce the marginal votes that she needs among people who are kind of cross pressured. They disapprove of Biden on the economy. They disapprove of the job that Biden's doing as president. They think the country's on the wrong track, but they're pro choice and they're nervous about Trump's personal qualities. Like, there are so many kind of amazing ways to look at this election. One way to look at this election is, oh my God, with all of Trump's flaws, why is he even in the game? That's what a lot of Democrats say. The other way to look at this election, as you and I discussed earlier today, Katie, is, oh my God, with all of the problems we've had since COVID, with inflation, with the wrong track as high as it is, with Biden's approval as low as it is, why is Harris still in the game? And that's because of Trump. If she were running against Nikki Haley, I think Haley would be running away with it. So you've got, this, you've got two phenomena. You have dug in two kind of calcified coalitions of voters for Democrats and Republicans who do not move no matter what. And that's like 90% of the country. And then the second thing is you have swing voters that are feeling whiplash because, like, for some of them, their heart's telling them one thing, but their wallet's telling them another thing, and their husband's telling them one thing, and their daughter's telling them another thing. And it's going to come down to those people.
But isn't it all about turnout? Like, are women going to turn out with this unprecedented gender gap? I guess one of the biggest in the. Didn't we talk about this, or was it somebody else? It was one of the biggest gender gaps
Biggest, it's I think it's almost certainly going to be the biggest gender gap in history.
in history. Okay, so isn't it all about who's going to turn out? Will men turn out more than women, or will women turn out more than men? Women traditionally do turn out to vote more than men. So is that a positive for the Harris campaign?
Yes.
And we're also,
And
what, aren't we 50.8% of the population? I mean, there are more women than men, right?
yeah, there are more women than men in terms of the population, but in terms of the voters, it's actually even better for women. I think the voting. I mean, we'll see. Like, once we have all the data back from this election, but my guess is it's going to be a 52 or maybe even a 53% female electorate. So if Harris wins women as big as Trump wins men, assuming it's distributed appropriately in the right states in the right ways, she should be able to win. I mean, Celinda Lake, who's a famous Democratic pollster, pioneering kind of woman in politics, had this rule for Democrats that if we win women more than the Republican wins men, we'll win the election. And that's the one thing to look for in the exit polls. But of course, we can talk about the exit polls later, but don't believe the first exit polls you hear is my short message.
Well, haven't they gotten some data, Brian, from the early voters? I think I read that early voting in Pennsylvania, uh, there were more women than men doing
Yes,
early voting in Pennsylvania. And then another state, it was more men than
only
women. And
Nevada. So across the seven, significantly more women are turning out early in all seven except Nevada. Now, that may be kind of correcting itself in Nevada, but you've got to be careful over interpreting early vote because you sort of have two things going on. One is people were comparing this to 4 years ago. 4 years ago, we were like locked in our houses. It was the
well, and
height of the
also
pandemic.
4 years ago, Donald Trump discouraged his supporters from voting early.
Exactly right. And now, early voting is something that Republicans helped develop, and Republican political strategists like begged and pleaded with Trump, don't do that again this time. We need to bank those votes early, and so he's flipped on that. So we just don't know the extent to which these early votes are cannibalizing election day vote for Trump, or are they new voters? I mean, it's like going back to your question about, isn't it all about turnout? Well, yeah, but it could also be about swing voters. It could also be about, in an election this close, a butterfly flaps its wings in Michigan, and that could turn the whole thing. So the answer to every question of does this matter is yes.
You know, people are asking, I was just checking out the question section, when we'll know the winner. And I know that some states have changed and actually improved their counting methodology or protocol, whatever you want to call it. So when do you think we'll have a good idea, Brian, of the results?
Well, I thought you might ask this question. So I did a little research
Thank you.
and I, my pleasure. And Georgia and North Carolina, I think, are going to be really good early indicators because they tend to count fast. They're on the East Coast. And so by like 9 or 10 Eastern, we're going to have real results
Really?
from, yeah, from those states. Yeah. I mean, not
Georgia and wait, Georgia
Georgia
and
and North Carolina, not complete results, but we're going to have a real sense of where those are headed. Now, if they're just incredible, if they're basically tied, are we going to know the winner at 10 o'clock Eastern? No, but we're going to know results fast. And it's not like California where, or even Nevada, where if it's really close, you may need 4 or 5 days after the election to get a sense of the results.
but won't there be some parts of North Carolina, some parts of Georgia? I mean, like Virginia, where Northern Virginia is almost like a separate state from the rest of Virginia. Similarly, there are pockets blue and red in all these states. So, do you think that? And sometimes some of the areas or districts take longer to vote than others. So,
Typically, the
how will
big urban districts come in later.
right?
And so you have a kind of a red mirage early, um, particularly if a lot of the mail-in and absentee are more Republican this time than they were 4 years ago. And the suburban and some of the rurals, come in faster because they're smaller and the urban vote comes in a little bit later. So I'm not saying we're going to know the results of those two states at 10 Eastern. I'm saying we're going to get substantial real results. We're going to have like maybe the second or the third wave of exits out, exit polling results from those states. We will have some sense. And then we'll also get clues in non-competitive states based on sort of swing districts. And so like, you know, in Virginia or Florida, we kind of know how those states are going to fall in the end, but you can pick certain congressional districts where, if Harris wins a slightly reddish place or Trump does the reverse, that may give us a sense of how the rest of the night's
What
going to go.
What about Pennsylvania? Do you think that's going to be much longer?
Slower. It's going to
Yeah.
be longer and slower.
So
Yeah. They,
what
they,
do you
they don't
think?
count
Like
so fast.
sorry, I'm sorry, interrupted. They don't what?
They don't count as fast in Pennsylvania. And I think, 8 years ago, Pennsylvania was called for Trump on election night. It was really late on election night, as I recall, like, 1 in the morning Eastern time, something like that. And at that point, it was crystal clear that Hillary could not win.
Right.
Um,
I remember that was when everybody was at the convention center, right? When Pennsylvania came in and it was like the nail in the coffin, remember?
It was at the Javits Center. Yeah. Katie and I were covering that election together for Yahoo 8 years ago. That was a hell of an evening. And I think nobody was more shocked than Donald Trump. I mean, when he when he came
Right.
out there to give his victory speech, Hillary didn't have a concession speech written, so she wanted to wait until the next morning, but she did call him to concede that night. I mean, one thing we can be sure of is even in the worst case scenario for Donald Trump, he is not going to concede that night. He's never going to concede. I mean, I think for him, there are two conceivable outcomes. Either he wins or it was stolen. And that's going to be kind of his MO throughout this
And I
process.
read a lot of things that said he might declare victory early. Have you been reading that too? And what do you do if he does that? I
Well,
mean,
I
what?
wonder if something's going to mess it up this time for him, because as you'll recall, 4 years ago, that was also the plan. And indeed, he did go out to the White House and say that. But what kind of screwed up the narrative for him was that Fox News called Arizona for Biden relatively early in the night, and so it really didn't seem even to Fox News viewers like it was the blowout for him that Trump was describing. I won and I won by a lot. He said something like that. And so, Fox kind of by mistake, I think, sort of lucked into the right call.
I
It was
think
clearly the
our friend
wrong.
John Ellis might have been responsible for that.
Well, I mean, maybe John would acknowledge this. I mean, as far as I can tell, it was the wrong judgment given what we knew at the time about how close Arizona was going to be to call it for Biden. No, but no other network and the AP, they did not call it for Biden for a long time. But the fact that Fox did it was such an earth-shaking event that it ruined Trump's whole ability to do what he wanted to do. And so that's going to be a huge question tomorrow night. Like, is something going to come in? Like, I mean, I'm not saying this is going to happen, but if North Carolina, which counts pretty fast, were called for Harris at midnight, that would really destroy Trump's ability to say I won the election, because his path without North Carolina is pretty narrow. It's still there, but it's pretty narrow.
And Georgia, he's ahead or they're tied. I think you told me about a week ago to not be surprised if Harris wins Georgia.
I think they're about tied. Um, I have a friend who's working that race, who's a very kind of conservative, realistic person on the Harris side, and he thinks like a 40 or 45% chance they win the state. So she has a very real chance of winning it, and
Doesn't
Georgia and
sound
Pennsylvania.
like a very big chance, 40 or
If
45%.
if you knew the person I was talking to, that's like optimistic for him. So the old line about you always some people see the light at the end of the tunnel and some people see the tunnel at the end of the light.
Yeah.
That's these. Anyway, I think the two most important swing states are Pennsylvania and Georgia. If Harris wins, if Trump can win Pennsylvania, or if Harris can win Georgia, I think they would both effectively block the path to 270 for the other. Um, Now, the most sort of the more normal scenario would be Harris winning Pennsylvania, Trump winning Georgia, and then it's kind of a dogfight for Michigan, Wisconsin, and the other key battlegrounds. But if that happens,
Um,
by the way, if just to get back to your Pennsylvania point, if that were to happen, if Harris were to win Pennsylvania, she would be in the stronger position without question.
Let me ask you before we go, Brian, because, and by the way, everyone, Brian's going to be joining me tomorrow. So is Nancy Pelosi. So is John Ellis, who is going to have access to a lot of the data. Will you have access to a lot of the data from the exit polls, Brian?
I should have some exit poll data. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll share what I'm allowed to share. I think they make you sign some stuff on like penalty
Oh,
of death. I don't want
really?
the
Were you
exit poll police to come
were
and
Were you going
arrest
to
me.
say something about exit polls before about how believable they are? Were you going to say a note of caution about those?
Yes. So typically, and Katie, you'll remember this from all your years covering election nights for various networks. At 5 Eastern, usually the first wave, as they call it, of exit poll results come in. And uh, that wave, for example, in 2004 showed John Kerry winning by a lot. That wave in 2016 still showed Hillary winning pretty comfortably. Those exit poll results get adjusted um, based on new information, new results from precincts, from interviews with voters as the night goes on. So for the people watching, if you happen to hear, from a friend or on Twitter or wherever that the early exits say X, Y, or Z, just take it with a lot of salt because that can change.
I also just, okay, real quickly, white women went for Trump in 2016 over Hillary Clinton.
Right.
What percentage of white women for Trump versus Hillary? Do you remember?
I think it was like 53 or 54.
So what, how are, and it sort of sounds funny to say, but what is that demographic looking like now?
Well, they're still white. No, I think,
What,
sorry.
tell me about white women.
um, I think one of the great questions of this election cycle is going to be working class white women, because college educated white women are kind of foundational supporters of Kamala Harris. She may win them by 25 or 30 points. Um, Non college men are critical core supporters of Donald Trump. He may win them by 30 points or more. And so you think about the two groups that I sort of didn't describe that are whose kind of identities conflict in a sense. The college educated men or the non-college educated women. And I think in those two groups you may have the story of the whole election. Do non-college educated women come out in big numbers? Do they support? I don't think Harris needs to win them, but does she get a bigger does she get more support than Hillary got? She probably needs more support than Biden got 4 years ago because she's got some leakage on the other side of her coalition among male voters. And conversely, does Trump hold the same number of college educated white men that he got 4 years ago? Or, people don't really think about this, but that was pre-Dobbs. 2020, Roe v. Wade was still the law of the land. So this is the first presidential election post-Dobbs, and these men, have wives and girlfriends and daughters. There is not a huge gender divide on abortion. People just, some people lazily call this kind of a women's issue. It's really not, and that will be fascinating to watch as well.
Yeah, so interesting, all these different constituencies, as you said, and they're divided within, the Jewish vote is divided because there's a perception that Donald Trump will be stronger for Israel. And then we've got, as you said, Latinos in different parts of the country are less conservative or more conservative, younger, older, et cetera, et cetera. So people are like you are really going to have to dig into these numbers and these groups to kind of identify trends. Before we go, I wanted to ask you about the House and the Senate. I interviewed Nancy Pelosi at the 92nd Street Y because Bob Costa had to drop out, and so she was
How are you
pretty.
anyone's backup? That's
That's
ridiculous.
okay. That's okay. I was happy to do it. I was happy to help out because I know what that's like and how frantic it is. But she was pretty confident that the Democrats would win the House and Hakeem Jeffries would be the Speaker of the House. How is that looking?
Um, I hate to provide an unsatisfying answer, but it's about 50-50, and I think it's really going to follow the presidential. Um, we've gone so far from split ticket voting in this country. It used to be that people would vote for the candidate and not the party, and they really look for the individual, and that's mostly gone. People are kind of red or blue now. My one interesting statistic is that if you look at every Senate race, and this applies to House races too, in a sense, you look at every Senate race in 2016 and 2020 combined, the last two presidential elections, only one of them went in a different direction than the presidential result in that state. And that was Susan Collins in Maine, even though Biden won Maine.
Mhm.
So, like, is John Tester's brand strong enough that he's going to be able to overcome Trump winning Montana? Maybe. Is Congressman so and so's brand strong enough? You do have 7 Biden won districts in California represented by Republican members of Congress, and basically all those races are hugely competitive. But it would be surprising if a lot of them diverge from the presidential result. I think the top of the ticket is sort of driving everything here.
So okay, so that's the House. What about the Senate?
Well, the Senate, you have to give the Republicans the advantage because you think about it. Right now it's 51-49 Democratic. Joe Manchin is retiring. West Virginia has gone from being a Democratic stronghold to a swing state to a Republican bastion. Um, there's no drama in that Senate election. Governor Jim Justice and his adorable bulldog named Baby Dog are going to the United States Senate. That race is cooked. And so that drops the Democrats down to 50-50. So in that scenario, if Harris won, Vice President Tim Walz could break the tie and the Democrats would still have Senate control, but that would mean they would need to hold John Tester's seat in Montana, which Trump will carry, uh, Sherrod Brown's seat in Ohio, which Trump will carry.
Sherrod
Jackie
Brown
Rose,
is there. Isn't Sherrod Brown so popular in Ohio?
he is popular, but it's just hard to overcome the presidential race
Yeah.
going in a different direction. And so, we will see. Um, then you have, I would say, the kind of the next tier down are races like Nevada and Arizona, where the Democrats are slightly favored. But if Trump manages to win those two states, it is not inconceivable that the Republican Senate candidate rides his coattails to victory. um, More likely in Nevada than in Arizona. Although I still think that Jackie Rosen in Nevada and Ruben Gallego in Arizona are going to win those races. But
Isn't he
stepping
running
back,
against Carrie Lake, and isn't she doing really poorly?
he's running against Carrie Lake. She's doing poorly, but she's not 15 points behind like Mark Robinson. She's maybe 5 points behind, 7 points behind.
Hmm.
Um, but if the presidential result and the Senate result just matched, then the Republicans would gain three, and you'd have a 52-48 Republican majority.
So it's
And so,
conceivable. It's conceivable we would not have divided. I mean, that the Republicans could control everything.
oh, it's even in a sense worse than that. You could have Donald Trump losing the popular vote by 3 or 4 million and unified Republican control of Washington, including a Supreme Court that effectively says he can assassinate his political enemies. And as long as it's an official act, that's okay. And no branch of Congress to stand up to him, certainly not the Supreme Court to stand up to him. And he's learned not to appoint anyone around him who will stand up to him. So that is a conceivable outcome tomorrow.
Let's not end on that note.
No.
Let's end on the the other possible outcome.
Well, the
Uh,
other possible outcome is okay, John Tester seems to be doing better. Both analysts in both parties acknowledge that. You could have a scenario where a lot of districts won by Biden and that are probably going to be won by Harris sweep in Democratic members of the House. And then you have a Democratic House, a Democratic White House, and maybe a tied Senate if Tester can hang on and if Sherrod Brown can hang on. I think the most sort of reasonable optimistic scenario for Harris, or the more conservative optimistic scenario, is she gets the House, but she doesn't get the Senate. It's a narrowly divided Republican Senate, and it's a Democratic White House.
all right. Well, that's a little better note to end on, I think, instead of, oh Lord, I can't believe what they're talking about with RFK Jr. Like basically being the health czar and running everything, and maybe vaccines would be.
Yeah,
I don't.
vaccines would be optional, and we take the fluoride out of the drinking water. Yeah. Does he have any public health credential or degree or anything like that? I don't think
I
so.
don't think so. I think he's an environmental lawyer, I believe. But it's very interesting. This whole, I was talking to my Pilates teacher about this whole MAHA movement, Make America Healthy Again,
Right.
where they've co opted a lot of people who are worried about sort of the food supply. And, and with good reason, there are a lot of things to be concerned about. But somehow, I guess RFK Jr. has convinced them through his association with Donald Trump that he will, help with those issues. But he's a vaccine deny, a vaccine not denier, what do you call it? He's yeah, it's
Yeah. He's
yeah,
he's uh,
sorry,
he's
vaccine.
opposed to
Thank
vaccines.
you, thank you. So
I mean,
a lot of his
yeah.
seem based in science. Anyway, I gotta go. You gotta go. All my people watching this, you guys, thank you for tuning into this. I don't know if you made anybody feel any but better, Brian, but at least you've got the latest. And I know the Harris campaign is trying to play down the Iowa poll a bit, or at least that's what I heard, because they don't want to temper enthusiasm in other states, right? Where people might think, oh, she's doing fine. I don't have to vote, right?
Yeah, these states are incredibly close. Everybody should vote. Um, it is still kind of astonishing that this poll came out and shows Harris actually in the lead in Iowa, which Trump won by 8 points 4 years ago. He won it by 8 points 8 years ago too.
But
Um,
I think it
it's
showed just how motivating, as you pointed out to me, and as I used on Larry Sabato, acting like I knew this, Brian, even though you had told me that they had recently passed, I think Larry said in September or in the summer, a 6-week abortion ban. So maybe people are underestimating just how powerful this issue is in terms of motivating people to vote and get out to the polls.
I think that's entirely possible. Yeah, it was only this summer that the 6 week abortion ban, which is effectively a total abortion
Right.
ban, went into effect in Iowa, and it's very unpopular. And you could imagine, across a lot of these states, women and men just coming out, fighting for that issue.
Yeah, interesting. All right, you're the best, Brian. Thank you. Thanks everybody for watching. Tune in tomorrow, starting at around 6 or 6:30. I'm just going to be doing these rolling interviews with a lot of smart people, including Brian Goldsmith, and many others who I think you'll be interested in hearing from. So if you get tired of listening to the incessant yada 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 on cable, or you're just feeling like you need a familiar face to help you understand this election, tune in.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for
Bye.
having me.
Okay. Bye,
Bye.
Brian. Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Good night.